All right, folks, we're going to wrap it up with a couple things. The question is, why should West Hartford care, and what can we do? And certainly, what are we already doing? Certainly, why we should care is because we have immigrants and immigrant families and undocumented immigrants living in our community in West Hartford, right? Everything that's been said is relevant to this part of our world, and certainly with the neighboring communities around us as well. And we constantly talk about the kind of value of diversity, the value of immigrants in our community. So this is part of our values, right? Our core value as is professed and discussed over and over again, certainly by our elected officials, and I'm certainly guilty of that myself. I should say from the get-go, I had a conversation recently with our chief of police and our mayor, and they are on this, in the sense that this is common practice. A lot of the things that Anna was talking about as far as practice of not providing information, of not working with federal officials, all of this is common practice in West Hartford, just as is working with immigrant families to help them get accustomed to town, etc. I know from my own work, and my colleagues on the board would share this with me, that on the Board of Education and in their schools, our public schools in town, this is something that we've increasingly been doing. We have a new director of diversity and inclusion and equity, where the town is at the forefront of the state and curriculum around human rights, about religious inclusion, a range of other kinds of things. So there's a lot going on already in West Hartford. Yet we have immigrant families and undocumented people in this town that are afraid, that are feeling anxious about this moment for all the reasons that Anna and Lucas stated. We just don't know, right? There's a lot of things that we just don't know and we can't control. And so I think certainly part of my argument is that Connecticut, and yes, our governor, who's our governor certainly for another couple of years, but after that, who knows, has taken a step with the Trust Act in 2013, said this, and the Trust Act was a response to the Secure Communities, and now it's called the PP or something else, saying that Connecticut will not cooperate with federal officials. So taking a stance, and one of the first states in the country to do so. So we're fortunate to be in Connecticut for that reason. We're fortunate to be in West Hartford for all of the above reasons. But I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough because we're in such an unusual time, right? And that we need to reconsider how our town supports and protects its undocumented neighbors here now today. And I don't think it's sufficient to say that the policies are already in place now, and they are. So the ask is, and I'm going to pass around a couple of kind of ideas, sort of best practices, following up on what Anna talked about. I had them on my thing, but Sue shut it down. But it doesn't matter. So I'll get you later. And I also want to be clear that what I'm talking about, although we've emerged from a presidential campaign that was kind of rife with these ugly false equivalencies between two different candidates, that we're not trying to find a balance here between hurting people's feelings and talking about inclusion. We're talking about protecting people's rights to exist, right? These are very different conversations, and this has a kind of moral depth and importance that we need to take very seriously. Another thing I want to say, that the reason I love that we're all here together now, we're talking about this specific topic now, that it's more broadly about a conversation about creating a welcoming, just, and equitable community for all people, not just immigrants and everyone else. And I want to make a quick shout out to a recent occurrence in our country, which is the protests over indigenous land rights in North Dakota at Standing Rock. And they reminded us, among other things, of the power of coalition building, right? About the power of solidarity and joining together in resistance to injustice. And our work here for undocumented immigrants really should be the beginning. And again, not that we're going to do this in this town, but I think this is a call to action. Is the beginning of bringing us together in coalition with the rights of Muslims, women, blacks, Jews, individuals, disabilities, LGBT community, and others. And in fact, as Beth Kerrigan right there helped me remember when we were having this conversation, it's the struggles of undocumented immigrants draw much of the strength and the models historically from feminists and queer activists organizing and coming out of the shadows and proudly and loudly stating, "Here I am, I'm here to stay." So we have a lot to learn from these kind of intersectional coalitions, and this, I think, is part of a much larger conversation, but I want to stay focused on on the task at hand, which is immigrants. So some concrete steps to keep in mind. And again, this is combining from some best practices, again, that Anna was talking about. I'm looking at places from around the country. Certainly we know Hartford, East Haven, New Haven have set some of the standards for this. And as Anna's saying, this is not necessarily a call for a sanctuary city, but it's a call for kind of different kinds of practices in place that support these communities and these people in our communities, whether it's a police ordinance, whether it's a new city policies, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll pass this around. And again, the reason we're here is to share information, to have us kind of think about what maybe our next steps are. I don't have enough for everyone, so we're going to have to share the love. Pass around. One is certainly to reaffirm West Hartford's commitment to all of its residents by issuing a public statement. I think this public piece is critical, right? Again, from my experience, and you should find out your own, that we already do this as a town, but to state it publicly in support of our undocumented individuals and their families. And this is a tricky part because the concern here is if we publicly state this, then does that put a target on the back of our vulnerable citizens? And that's part of the conversation. So to what extent do we do that? And given the climate, but I think this is something we need to consider. And the kind of, obviously some towns, up to 500, have been doing this around the country. Do we need to do this in West Hartford? Is that the best move for our particular town? Clarify the communications and enforcement relationship between the town and the federal government. And Anna already kind of laid out what that means as far as intervention and detainment and these kinds of things. And this also, part of that is giving training to town employees, so everybody who works for the town has a legal understanding and the cultural competence to be both welcoming and ask the right questions and not to ask the wrong questions of people. And certainly, again, all these other kinds of things that Anna was talking about, not releasing names, declaring that the police department will not agree with ICE officials, and that no town agency will deny benefits to any resident of the town of West Hartford, right? And again, just to be clear, this isn't civil disobedience. There's nothing kind of essentially kind of fundamentally radical about this. All of these kinds of practices are already in place. There are laws already in place. There's a trust act already in place. This is really just reaffirming constitutional rights and practice that exist in the country, ordinance that exists at the state, laws that exist at the state level. So it's the opposite of that, right? It's challenging unconstitutional enforcement against undocumented individuals and communities, right? So that's the main practice. And there's a lot of other things, and I'm speaking also here as a UConn professor, and thanks to our students, we have essentially a quasi-sanctuary campus at UConn, which I think is amazing. A lot of work went into that from our courageous students to make that happen. And what we've done there is created essentially a list of other kinds of services for our students, things like centralized and enhanced mental health services, legal services that are available, more training, enhanced training for staff about know your rights and for our students as well. We have a website at UConn for undocumented students, a central portal, a centralized information. So if someone comes in West Hartford, of course, it would need to be in different languages, these kinds of things. Then think about information sharing, and these kinds of events also are important as well. And I think appropriately in this space, also connecting with our religious communities, because this is where the idea of sanctuary city is certainly emerging out of the Central American Wars in the 70s and 80s. This is where the first sanctuary movement really took place. And so I think we have a lot to learn from that history in partnering with our good friends at this church and other synagogues and mosques, et cetera, in town as well. So that's the spiel, right? That's the presentation. We're going to open it up to questions. We have plenty of time.